Yeah, yeah.
Welcome back to the Question Everything podcast. Welcome back. It's Bria again, and I'm here alone this time because this is a topic today that I'm really passionate about. And Kathy kind of gave me the green light to just speak about it because it's something that I have been obsessed with and have been diving really deep into lately. So I'm just going to try to jump into it. To make a long story short, this episode is going to be about the world fairs and basically how our modern society, most of our inventions from the modern society that we live in today, were introduced initially at the world's fairs. We're also going to talk a little bit about Tartaria, orphan trains, insane asylums, and more. So, kind of how I wanted to start this thing off was piggybacking off of our last episode where we talked about the resetting of global civilization multiple times over, whether that be through disasters that were God given or man made disasters over time, and how we kept getting bombarded and bombarded. And the society that we live in right now is a result of finally catching our breath after the most major global resets and being able to pass down the knowledge that we took from the people before and kind of reintroduce it now. So honestly, there's so much to talk about with this whole World's Fair thing, but there's so much to talk about. So starting off, basically, I read like 10 articles. I'll put them below, but compiled from these articles, I basically made sort of a presentation that I had prepared for you guys, which I have like a lot of, we're going to get into a lot today. But before we go too far, we're gonna we're gonna kind of give context to what these world fairs were about. And like I said, I did a bunch of research and I compiled my notes. So you'll actually be able to see the sources here too. But I'm gonna share my screen so you can see. Alrighty. All right. So starting with the World's Fair in Britain, very fascinating to me because the whole World's Fair ordeal supposedly was started as a brainchild of Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. And basically, he became, because of his continental background, he had a special understanding of the potential value of an exhibition showcasing Britain's grandiose inventions. And basically, okay, context. After the wars in 1800, after the Civil War and everything, we have our industrial revolution, so to say. And a lot of these inventions of the industrial revolution were first introduced at Britain's World Fair because Britain was spearheading a lot of these inventions. So, so the World's Fair in Britain was held in the Crystal Palace, and it was a very large success, very grandiose event. I actually have a picture here of what the event looked like. The thing about these Tartarian structures, and I keep saying Tartaria with hopes that most of you in the audience know what I'm talking about, but the thing about these world expeditions, these world fairs, is supposedly these buildings were built in a couple of months' time, maybe a year's time, and then they were destroyed after. But these buildings were so grand and honestly more impressive than a lot of buildings we have today. And they're kind of a modern marvel, like the eight wonders of the world. They're modern marvel because how do they invent those things? How do they build those things? Well, according to what some would consider Tartarian lore, these buildings were here before these world's fairs, and they kind of just repurposed these buildings because we had advanced civilizations before. It just so happened that through war, most of the evidence of our advanced civilizations architecturally were destroyed, and I believe that's a big reason we have wars. But moving on, going back to the notes. Okay. So fascinating. So in this expedition, the inventions that were so basically this was a grand the first World's Fair. The purpose of it was to show off Britain's newest inventions. That was notably the steam engine, the telephone, the typewriter, the mechanical calculator, the zipper, the dishwasher, the first mass-produced gum, Wrigley's, spray paint. So these inventions were showcased at that Britain's World's Fair, and it being a successful World's Fair, other countries decided that they wanted to follow suit. They wanted to show off how their country had advanced in the recent years, and basically all of members from every other country for the most part would come to these world fairs and see these modern inventions and take some nuggets and take those back home so that they could start to invent things themselves and continue to move us towards the future, right? So, moving on. I wanted to talk about the next world fair after that, which was um that was the World's Fair in Paris, actually. Crazy. It's crazy. Yeah, so at the Paris Fair in 1988 in 1889, the Eiffel Tower was introduced. So that's also a big thing at these World's Fairs. A lot of them had a grand structure that they introduced that became a staple of society. For example, the Eiffel Tower was introduced at the World's Fair. So, like I'm saying, a lot of modern imagery and inventions were created then. I also wasn't really fond of the fact that African Americans were excluded from the World's Fairs, but I'm going to expand on that later. Paris Universal World's Fair was very prolific. It was very beautiful, very grandiose. It was incredible. But the Paris World's Fair and the Britain World's Fair weren't profitable. They were very expensive to put on, but they did not incur profit. They were basically only a way to showcase how grand a country was, and because of that, the World's Fairs would happen with years in between them. They would happen with years in between them. So, the Chicago's World's Fair was four times bigger than the Paris World's Fair. So I wanted to talk about the Chicago World's Fair not only because I currently live in Chicago, but because it was a turning point for World's Fair, so to say. Like I said, it was the most profitable World's Fair, and it was the first World's Fairs that introduced more than inventions. It introduced, like, more than industrial inventions, they introduced amusement inventions as well. So America in its nature, Chicago in its nature being so grandiose, had a whole pavilion designated to entertainment where they had giant live bands. They introduced, I believe it was, I forget which dance it was. I think it was like a swing dance, something like that, but that was introduced there. And the Vienna Sausage Company was introduced at the Chicago's World's Fair. And this was the first World's Fair that introduced pavilions for each country, which is very United States. So Britain's World's Fair only focused on Britain's inventions. So did France's World Fair, only focused on the best and brightest of France. The first Chicago World's Fair had pavilions from the top 43 countries that weren't US. And with that, people were able to showcase many different inventions. For example, Belgium chocolate was introduced at the Chicago World's Fair, and because of that, the founder of Hershey's chocolate pivoted from focusing on caramel products to making chocolate products. So again, this common theme of a lot of things from that we currently use being introduced at the World's Fair. Now, I feel like this introduction I gave to these three World's Fairs were a little bit botched, but I'm going to get into more detail right now on what inventions in specific, a list of them, were introduced at various World's Fairs. Okay. So starting with the Great Exhibition in London, the first World's Fairs. This to me is why this topic is so fascinating. What was showcased? The first steam engine, the first hydraulic press, water pumps, the printing press, the Colt revolver, so guns basically, the revolver. India rubber goods, so tires were introduced. Microscopes, precision measuring tools, false teeth, thermometers, the safety pin, surgical instruments, cement mixers, pressure cookers, meat slicing machines, stethoscopes, gramophones, diving suits, flashlights, electric heaters, sewing needles, water turbines, bread making machines, the electric clock, the electric doorbell, roller skates. These are inventions. Everything that I've listed are inventions that we still use today and are very prolific in our society today. I feel like there hasn't been much innovation in the industrial sector. There's been a lot of innovation in the technological space, like the web space, but when it comes to material things, most things were invented back then. All right, let's move on. Inventions from the 1855 Paris Expedition World's Fair. The artificial ice machine. So this is an 1855, by the way. The artificial ice machine, the hydraulic press, the wire rope, circular saw, the electromagnetic clock, incubator for chickens, inkjet printing. Inkjet printing in 1855? The meat chopper machine, ice cream making, the coffee grinder, sounds about French, the fabric dyeing machine, industrial scale, paper making machine, embroidery machine, sounds about French, gasometer. So, again, all of these inventions still very prolific today. And we're seeing how after the Great Resets, we had a rapid rebuilding of society and reintroducing of basic necessities, what we would consider basic necessities. So I ask you, do you think we are the most modern civilization? Let me not even go into that because that could be a whole other episode. Let's move on to the 1893 Chicago Expedition inventions. So if you notice, if you can see the screen, this is a very big list of inventions. But let's unpack. In 1893 Chicago Expedition, we have the birthplace of a skyscraper. The first skyscraper that was shown in Chicago, from what we know, in 1893. Neon lights. The early version of a modern cash register. This is in 1893. Well, in America, they'll show us programs of like the Wild West and like Western stuff and make it seem like these times are so primitive. Okay. Modern air conditioning in 1893. Modern plumbing fixtures. Early forms of X-ray technology. Incubators for premature babies. The bicycle. Fountain pens. Fountain pens. The fire sprinklers. Wind turbines. Gas-powered engines. Barbed wire. Electric sewing. So this is like 10 years after France, okay, or after England introduced sewing. Ice cream makers. Heaters. Electric generators in 1893. Fire extinguishers. Amusement park rides. Like I was saying, there were different pavilions at the Chicago World's Fair exclusively shown there first that had whole pavilions designated to amusements. One designated for music and dancing, one designated for amusement park rides. All over the world you have amusement parks. And some might wonder, why does it feel so American, amusement parks? Well, they were showcased first in Chicago. The vacuum, electric fan, The washing machine, 1893, guys. Processed meat and food preservation techniques. So, we have canned goods introduced for the first time. Elevators, hair clippers, gas pumps, electric drill, toasters, vending machines, motorcycle, flush toilets, sinks, porcelain bathtubs, the largest steam engine, the telephone, the typewriter, the mechanical calculator, the zipper, the dishwasher, the first mass produced gum was reintroduced on a larger scale, and spray paint again. I gave you a large list and it seems like, oh wow, they were so inventive during this time. It's farther than that. It's technology that has been drop fed to our society at a rapid rate so that we could get to, like I said, just the basic needs. Um, there's evidence to suggest that this type of technology, this information was passed down from previous generations. So what does that mean? It means that resets took people out, but before they were using this technology. So I'm thinking that these type of technology are your basic goods, your basic everyday stuff that you need. And we keep thinking that society has been so primitive for so long, but nah, the fallen angels since the beginning introduced technology to us, and then and then our society gets destroyed, but books remain, some people remain, and knowledge gets passed down. It's as simple as that. So another World's Fair that was very fascinating to me was the 1939 New York World's Fair. I believe that World's Fair was called the Age of Tomorrow, something like that. I actually really liked that World's Fair because it seemed very Jetson to me. It seemed very futuristic the way it looked. But some things that were introduced at this World's Fair. This is in 1939, by the way. So, to give context, after the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, every year there was a World's Fair showcased globally in different countries. After they realized that they could make this a profitable thing, it was replicated every year subsequently up until I believe it was the 60s or the 70s, but the 1939 World's Fair jumping to, like 50 years or so, give or take some decades, jumping to 1939, some other things that were introduced. Air conditioning. So before we had the predecessor to air conditioning, now we have full blown air conditioning is invented. If you want it, you can have it. The all electric kitchen, meaning, your electric stove, your refrigerator, your all electric kitchen. You got your outlets. This is in 1939. Baby monitors, the ballpoint pen, biometric in biometric identification system. So like thumbprint scanners, the black light, carbonated fruit drinks. So soda being invented in 1939. The car radio, the FM radio, the jukebox, lawn sprinklers, the LCD screen, the Polaroid camera, the photocopier, remote controls, roll-on deodorant, the rotary lawnmower, stereo sound systems, traffic signal systems, walkie-talkies, Velcro, video camera, yachts. So this is very interesting because again, a lot of countries depict the 1800s as such a primitive time where people were riding on horses and using um, oil lanterns and stuff like that to walk around. But if you were born in the late 1800s, darn, if you were born in the mid 1800s, you were introduced to a lot of the inventions that we use today. Wrap your head around that. If you were born in the mid 1800s, a lot of modern inventions were introduced back then. And, you know, if you were born in 1850, within your lifetime, maybe, by the time you're like 90 or 80s, You're seeing the invention of the car radio. You're seeing the invention of refrigerators, the jukebox, air conditioning, walkie talkies, the video camera, soda. You're seeing the invention of soda and canned peas if you were born in the mid 1800s. Like, really wrap your head around that in a time that we think people are just on horseback. No, it's deeper than rap, my friends. It's deeper than rap. And even by then, 1939, you had multiple skyscrapers around. In 1853, I mean, and sorry, excuse me, in 1893, the first skyscrapers were showcased in America in Chicago. 40, 50 years later, you have multiple skyscrapers. This is within a generation, within a lifetime. Our evolution in the past has been very rapid, very fascinating. So I have, if you want to pause and look at these notes, that's cool. I have some more notes on the Chicago's World's Fair because I found it very fascinating. Like, for example, the Palace of Fine Arts was the only fireproof building because of the value of the paintings exhibited, and it was one of two buildings designed to be permanent, and today houses the Museum of Science and Industry. And the other permanent building was for the World's Congress, currently the Art Institute of Chicago. I currently live in Chicago, so I've seen the Museum of Science and Industry and I've seen the Art Institute of Chicago. Even if these are the most grandiose buildings in Chicago, these are the most old looking grandiose buildings in Chicago. Like, and when you see these buildings and you're inside the Museum of Science and Industry, you wonder, wow, this is so huge. They built this? When did they build this? How? And I will show you what they look like actually. So this is the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Look how um this is a very massive building, and like the pictures don't do it justice on how big the structure is up close. Like when you are inside, I don't know how many stories it is. This is a very Tartarian-esque structure, I would say. And it's funny because this building, and I'll look up the Art Institute building, Chicago. These two are the only structures I've seen in Chicago that are this massive, that look um old fashioned in a sense, the way they're built. The picture of the Art Institute right now is not doing it justice. It is massive. Look at the size of the people next to the entryway. And these buildings were designed to withstand fire and all these things. I wanted to also talk about how during the times of the World's Fair, we had great fires all all across the United States and all across the world. We had a mass resetting of civilization where Chicago Great Fire. So this is a very famous story about how basically most of Chicago was burned down and most of its inhabitants were left homeless or had to flee during I forget which year it was. What year was it? 1871. 1871. So most buildings in Chicago were burnt down, which means society was reset. And the story goes, a cow kicked over a fire lantern, which basically spread a fire on a farm that spread to the whole city. I call BS. I mean, come on. They couldn't have come up with a better story. But besides that, there's stories like this all over. You have Great Fires of Philadelphia, like The Great Fire, I'm sure, I don't know, did New York have one? Let's see, just look up New York Great Fire. Let's see if there's Great Fire of New York. See, I didn't even know about that, but there's just literally in the most, let's see, California, Los Angeles, Great Fire, question mark? And you see how all of these pictures have the same feel because it was around the same time, and it shows you that all over the United States, back to back, you had great fires in the most major cities so that the world leaders, quote unquote, could rebuild society in the way they see fit. And a part of this was the World's Fairs. So even just seeing the Chicago Great Fire being in, I went too far, but the Chicago Great Fire being in 1871 and their World's Fair being in 1893, it's like, okay, 21 years after the World's Fair, they just so happened, 21 years after a fire that decimates their entire city, they just so happen to have the greatest inventions of that time in mass introduced there from Americans. Like 21 years after most of America has been decimated, these people are reintroducing knowledge they already had in a rapid way. I also wanted to talk about the orphan trains. I briefly mentioned in the previous episode how insane asylums were places for people who basically disagreed with the new narratives that were being pushed, and they disagreed with the new leaders that were being put in front of them after these great fires and these world's fairs, and people were put into insane asylums and their children were orphaned, or in these wars that happened in the 1800s, many children were orphaned. And um you have so orphanages, like I mentioned in the previous episodes, are basically mass programming centers. So they take children, and which is great when you have children, because then you could tell them whatever you want and they'll believe it for the rest of their life. You can, the Bible says, train a child how they should go, and that's how they'll be, and that's what these orphan asylums were for. Insane asylum, orphan asylums. These children were literally taught how to behave as individuals, what to believe about their history. Because if you think about it, my parents taught me about my history, where I come from, where my people came from, but they didn't have that. They had to have institutions teach them, so to say, where they came from, which was a bunch of lies, and they basically rewrote history, wrote textbooks. And the compulsory education system was created in the 1800s. Like, this is after a global reset. And going back to the orphan trains, you had thousands of orphans every day in America basically being transported from one end of the country to the next, with hopes and being lined up so that people who got with the program, who were okay with the new program, would buy who they want to buy, keep them as their children, and train them in the way they want to go, and basically send the rest to orphanages. And we have a lot less orphanages these days, and they're slowly trickling down because the programming is already in mass society, to the point where the parents in the house will program their children the bullshit. Like back in the day, people knew the truth and they tried to tell their children the truth, and they were deemed insane and their children were put in asylums. But now a lot of people are already programmed to the point where they're feeding their children lies themselves, where the government doesn't even, a lot of people are so busy working that the TV and music is what's programming them. It's what's teaching them how to live. Programming still exists. It's just remodeled and rebranded. But I really wanted to touch on the orphan trains because you had basically the leaders of society, the initiated, so to say, in quotes, they bought a bunch of children so that they could train them in the way they wanted them to go. I mean, why not? It was probably somebody had to do it, and it was probably boring those days, and they had very unlimited resources. So it's like, and look at this picture, like wanted homes for children. Friday, February 25th, 1910. A company of homeless children from the east will arrive at. So it's like people who weren't deemed insane and who got with the program and wanted children or wanted to create that life or wanted people to program for their own, because there are sick individuals like that. They had these posters where they just knew the time and place to meet up to get these children to reprogram. I was also wanted to talk about the baby incubators that were first introduced at World's Fairs, and um, talk about how they were basically able to create children or rapidly or basically allow children to grow without a mother, allow children to grow without a warm, loving environment. That's what these infant incubators were for. That's what I see them as. And I also, there's so much we can talk about, guys. And over the podcast, we're going to get a lot deeper. We're starting somewhat on the surface right now because we have to get the foundation down, but we're going to go deeper. Because even I wanted to talk about the cabbage patch babies. I hope Google will show me. Oh man, and that's the thing with like my dad calls things technology. Um but basically what I was going to say is that America society is very smart on how to sway sway the general populace from the truth, right? So there's this phenomenon called like cabbage patch babies, where it's like similar to this baby incubator thing. The concept of basically making babies en masse to repopulate civilization after whole countries have been decimated, bombed, great fires, mud floods. They had to repopulate. And, one woman, it's hard for one woman to have 100 children, because you have to repopulate cities quickly so you could have the cogs in the machine, so to say, Um, so the concept of cabbage patch babies is the concept of basically either through genetic experimentation or various ways like in vitro to basically create a large population of children in a rapid period of time so that we could repopulate civilization. And we have these pictures, cabbage patch babies. You'll see basically a whole bunch of them in a farm, and it's kind of, I see this as symbol. It could be taken literally, or it could be as symbolism, as they literally are like farming these children and mass creating them, and they'll be able to, instead of have them in a womb, have them in a baby incubator. So that's what these. So instead of you could, even now, I believe in cloning. Even now, I believe you could, as long as you have the right chemical synthesis happen, you can lead to an embryo being, um, you can lead to the process of reproduction, um, and I believe that in a lab you can lead to the process of reproduction from an embryo, and then you could put them in a baby incubator, which would be the womb, so to say, and then you have a mass number of children, which is what these cabbage patch babies are. Um, Speaking of baby incubators, there's this artist, Goldlink. I forget which album it was. Let's see what it was. No, 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 no. This album, Haram. So This album, it was interesting because me and my friend Kathy, who is usually on this podcast, we were talking about how this kind of looks like a baby in a womb ish. And to me, when I saw that, I immediately started thinking about either like cloning or like artificial embryo. I mean, this album was fire, actually. It was a really good album. But just thinking about that imagery, sometimes celebrities show us little nuggets, um, little nuggets of truth, right? But, okay, moving on. So, I also wanted to talk about how society will change imagery. Like, okay, so before, as you saw earlier, when I tried looking up Cabbage Patch Babies, what popped up was Cabbage Patch Kids, the dolls. And I feel like this invention and then naming it as Cabbage Patch Kids, one of the intentions was probably so that when we look up these things, it would sway us from the truth. It would bring up something completely different. Like, I would have to know to look up Cabbage Patch Babies Tartaria to get the actual imagery I'm looking for. But if someone just told me, hey, look up, gave me this whole spiel of Cabbage Patch Babies, but didn't mention Tartarian, told me, go look that up when you get home, really look it up, they'd have a hard time looking for it because of Cabbage Patch Kids. But because I know about Tartaria, I'm able to throw that in there and find what I need. So they're clever, man. They're really clever. Like, even when it comes to angels and fairies and stuff like that, aliens, like we talked about in the last episode, the imagery we get in our head is usually different than the actual truth because they know what image they want to put us, or rather, they just want to steer us away from the truth in any way possible. And they'll use these things. They'll use these tactics, they'll use these tactics, man. It's so crazy. In future episodes, we're definitely gonna get into like topics like MK Ultra, because, oh man, oh man. Before I get ahead of myself, though, because I know this has to end soon, I did want to briefly bring up this movie that I believe is called The Asylum. Let me see if I can find it. It's with James Franco. The Institute. I really wanted to bring this movie up. Okay, let's share my screen. Okay. Okay. So I was responding to an important text, but The Institute. The reason I bring up this movie, please, guys, please watch this movie, bro. I accidentally stumbled across it because I was on one of those shoddy, like, you know how we have Netflix and HBO Max. I was on like a Freevee or a Tubi or something like that. Just because, like, I have those other ones, but sometimes you got to go to the obscure ones to find obscure movies, right? This movie's so good. So the reason I clicked on it actually is because James Franco, he's a great actor, and it's called The Institute. I was like, oh, Asylum? My mind has already been reeling about this stuff. This was a great example of how they will take people who are normal and mess their mind up. So the crazy part is the setting of this was the late 1800s. The setting of this was after a war. Basically, the main character is a woman, and her brother takes her into this asylum because their parents both died from a war. And I believe this war was in America, which is very interesting because they don't talk about wars besides the Civil War. They don't talk about any wars in the 1800s. But anyway, I believe that was a part of a resetting of a civilization. Their parents died from the war, and he's like, my sister's not taking well to this. I'm gonna bring her to an institute, right? She's actually not doing that bad. She comes to this place. There are some crazy people, naturally, but at first they keep people who come in away from these crazy people. They're in their own ward, they got their own section, and it's very rare that, people who are semi-normal cross paths with these people. I'm watching this movie like it's a documentary, you know what I'm saying? Because they like to show truths in these quote unquote fictional movies, and they like to show lies in truthful films like documentaries. Anyway, so right off the bat, the person who is the main doctor at this institute is taking a very liking to this patient that is the daughter of the people who died, and he basically uses her as an experiment of how to uh, split personality, basically, how to incur split personality. So it's showing you how, because most of us who watch this probably know about MK Ultra. We probably already know about in the mid 1900s the US, Russia, Germany, UK used various mind control techniques like MK Ultra to incur split personalities for people to basically, at first it started off to create assassins, because it's not natural for a human to be okay with killing people over time, and that's all they do. They created split personality so that people could disassociate from being an assassin. If you get the chance, watch this movie called American Ultra, MK Ultra, American Ultra, um, that has Kristen Stewart in it, and it basically shows how they use mind control tactics to create a split personality and create assassins where they don't even know they're assassins. They're just living their day, eating toast with their love, and then they just someone triggers a code word and they're on a mission all of a sudden, and they don't even recognize them when they come back home. It's like back to normal. They don't even know because their lover is their handler and making sure that they think everything's normal. All right, boom. So this is like predates this shit. In this institute, he is telling her, "I'm gonna give you these elixirs so that you feel better. You're naturally you're feeling all types of effed up right now, and I'm gonna give you some drugs to make you feel better." So this predates pills. He's giving her literally elixirs, and right. So she's drinking these elixirs, and she has nightmares. So she wakes up and she wanders off to see, basically, say, evil rituals, dark rituals being performed in the same institute. So she wakes up the next day, tells him about it. He's saying, "Man, you've been having some crazy dreams." And she's like, "Dang, I've been having some crazy dreams." She keeps taking the drugs he's giving her. Over time, these rituals get more and more dark, and she just so happens to participate in them, but she doesn't think it's happening because she thinks it's all a dream, which is a side effect of these drugs, right? So she's participating in these rituals, becoming and having a sort of split personality because of the way, if you see this movie, you'll see the evil things he does to basically split her mind. And the thing is, he knows he's already dealing with someone who's fragile because her parents died. And every time her brother comes and sees that she's acting differently, basically as time goes on, they say, "You can't come around here anymore. You can't give her advice." And then they program her to turn against her brother. So I don't want to spoil too much, but in the end, she ends up harming her brother. In the end, she ends up harming a lot of people. And she ends up becoming not only a killer, but someone who recites evil things from evil books. And she becomes someone who is taken over by the dark side, so to say. Um, and I'm saying those things to kind of keep it light, but basically she becomes like a witch. She becomes like a satanic force to be reckoned with, who allows herself to be possessed. So also that's a whole other thing. I do believe split personality, MK Ultra, is allowing the body to become hollowed out so that something else, a spiritual entity who is dark, can come in and take over and do what